In a wildly entertaining and interesting news conference, White Sox chairman Jerry Reinsdorf spoke for 30 minutes, covering everything from the shooting at the rate to why he made a change at the top. How would you summarize the event to a White Sox fan who missed it?
I'd say sit down for a moment because it's going to take a while to explain what just happened. It was, as I said, coming into the show, remarkable for the wrong reasons, extraordinary at a time when I think the White Sox needed an ordinary change at the top. You don't want to make news for the method. You want to make news for kind of what things imply in terms of hope. And what the White Sox did yesterday was they confirmed so many of our suspicions that they were a team that can't get out of its own way. And Jerry Reinsdorf really doesn't know what he doesn't know, and frankly isn't interested in finding out. That, to me, is as disappointing as anything. I give him credit for facing the questions. I give him credit for stepping forward because this is what the White Sox organization really needed to happen. They needed to hear from the chairman. But it's just what he had to say, I think, wasn't inspiring. It was deflating. It was hiring somebody internally because they represented the quickest way to win now, and yet contradicting that by saying he's not going to, or implying that he's not going to have the money to go out and spend to win now, which is typically the way these things happen. As for the shooting, there's still a mystery. He said that. As for the sale, he's not interested in selling the team. Okay. He said a lot of other things about the future that I think show that he is concerned about his legacy. If he's truly concerned about his legacy, then he will redirect his thoughts and maybe backtrack and go into this offseason spending in a way that reflects that. I don't think that's the wisest thing for this organization. I think they need to reset, rebuild, and start over. I don't know if Chris Getz is the right man for the job, but yesterday we heard Jerry Reinsdorf kind of put confidence in a guy who hasn't earned it yet. And overall, if I'm talking to White Sox to summarize what they missed, you missed the most interesting press conference the Sox have had in a very, very long time.
I think interesting is a good word for it. It depends if you want to go glass half full or glass half empty, because the glass half empty, there's plenty of different routes to get to glass half empty. But on the glass half full part, if I were a Sox fan, I guess I would try to grasp onto two things. And they both talked about it, both Jerry and Getz. This is not going to be a complete rebuild, and they play in the American League Central. And those are two things that if you want to be positive this morning, that you can grab onto. It's not going to be a full teardown. They're not starting from scratch. They're not digging a brand new hole. And they do play in the division that is very, very winnable.
And Chris Getz referred to that as the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that the White Sox are in the AL Central. And I'm thinking, as I'm hearing Chris Getz say that, I'm thinking, no, sir. Sir, you are the elephant in the room. You, sir, are the suspect at this point. But I think the way this question is posed is perfect. Wildly entertaining because it was the voice of Jerry Reinsdorf. And when I got in my car, I turned on the score, listening to Parkins and Spiegel, and I'm coming home from Hallis Hall, and they are playing Jerry Reinsdorf. And then I kind of get myself centered. I set my base because I'm like, is this really Jerry Reinsdorf speaking? So for the first few minutes that I was listening, I was just thinking, thank you, Jerry. Thank you. Thank you for speaking. And then I was able to finally listen to the actual content of what he was saying after getting over the actual surprise that he was speaking. And he confirmed the Jerry Reinsdorf talking points over the last decade plus that we have been spewing out. So I actually felt good because it confirmed what we were saying and that we're not just spewing stuff out there that Jerry Reinsdorf is not saying, because in some way, shape, or form, unfortunately, throughout the press conference, he said all of the things that we tend to say in a critical eye towards Jerry.
He really did, and I think when you don't hear from somebody, you start to wonder if those things are true. And yesterday he reminded us they indeed are true. This should last us another decade of generalization, right?
You're absolutely right. But and one more thing, too. I think the most disappointing part of it is that he used the word autonomy and then went on to giggle about the notion of somebody like Shohei Ohtani. And then he also said, as all owners, are we all entitled to set the payroll? And that's the way it's going to be. And I'm figuring out, too, that my Jerry Reinsdorf, there are notes of Mike Tice in it. They're not. Larry. I'll try to straighten it out by 10.
Good, doing well.
Yeah, thank you, Bears.
You started the question by saying,
That's the voice of Steve Stone. He's here at 9. What was your impression of new White Sox GM Chris Getz? What kind of executive do you think he'll be, altering the roster, especially if he plans on competing in 2024?
Well, I'm not unfamiliar with Chris Getz at all. I do have a healthy amount of respect for him, and I did in his role as a director of player development, even though the results weren't glowing. This isn't somebody, I think, who has done the job in player development and you think, okay, he is ripe for a promotion because they've done such a great job of developing players. They have not. And frankly, on his watch, there have been elements of scandal. We can talk about the Omar Vizquel incident. We can talk about Wes Helms. And he was asked about those things, and I think he handled them as well as anybody on their first day on the job could handle them in terms of addressing it and not ignoring it and not sounding too defensive. I do think he probably deserves the benefit of the doubt he hasn't earned yet. And I say that only because I think everyone that takes over a new job, you'd like to have an open mind in evaluating how they're going to do it. So I'm going to try to do that with Chris Getz. He was acknowledging openly the burden, he called it, the burden of being an internal hire. That's the right word. He has a tremendous burden of being an internal hire. As we kidded, this was not a league-wide, nationwide search. This was a building-wide search. The Sox hired somebody that they're likely to run into in the lunchroom at Guaranteed Rate Field.
I love that.
And I think that you want to avoid these things, and they circumvented the process by leaning on their past in terms of hiring minority candidates and employing them in management roles. To me, that should not excuse them or preclude them from doing it this time. So I think that Chris Getz will approach the job like somebody who's intent on contending in 2024. So the rebuild failed, but we're going back to the old way of doing White Sox business. Is that's trying to keep things together on a year-to-year basis, it sounds like.
It's a big job, period, and it becomes a bigger job because of the fact that he knows that he's an internal candidate and he doesn't have everybody on his side. It's not easy to take on the media the first time around. I'm actually looking forward to hearing what he has to say to you guys at 8:25 after having a day to kind of take it all in. And I wonder, did he listen back to his question and answers with the media or other various interviews that he did? And I'm curious to hear, okay, who has developed? Who have you developed on the minor league level that has come up and shown it on the major league level? And what was the break between you and Kenny and everybody at the top, your
Rick Hahn.
bosses?
Did you forget his name already?
Rick Hahn.
Forgettable.
What was that like? I wondered yesterday, speaking of Rick Hahn, as I was listening to this in my kitchen, I wondered, where is Rick listening to this?
Oh, that's hilarious.
I guarantee he was listening. He's wired that way.
Well,
he
why
was
wouldn't
listening.
I'd be listening. Wouldn't you be listening?
The Bahamas.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, there could be that too. Like if Rick could just take his money and get away. I was also thinking too. I don't know if you guys caught Jerry. Speaking of that, Dustin, Reinsdorf said yesterday of his two guys, very complimentary of Kenny Williams. Says Kenny was a very good talent evaluator, and then he said Rick's skills were negotiating contracts.
Yeah, right.
Said.
Right.
Still with the that is from 10 years ago.
That's damning.
Oh, I know. You could tell he was not that close to Rick.
Does he know baseball? I mean,
yeah, maybe not.
As a baseball evaluator, he's a good contract negotiator.
That's
okay.
How he looked at Rick Hahn, and that also explains to me potentially the power dimension that existed. That Jerry Reinsdorf empowered and encouraged Kenny Williams to make trades, to trade Jake Burke. Hey, you do what you want to do. This guy will negotiate. Don't worry. We'll take care of that. But What did I think of the way Getz was in the press? I thought he comported himself very well. Like, we're just talking about the press conference. Like, he said all the right things, threw all the bullet points out there, well-written, all of that stuff, knew what he would be facing, knew the questions. What kind of executive do I think that he'll be in altering the roster? I mean, he did say confidently no one is untouchable. We'll see. We'll see about that. There are people that he will not be allowed to touch, but nobody's untouchable.
That seems ridiculous to me.
What, that he said that?
You're not going to, as a first-time general manager in your first offseason, trade Luis Robert Jr.
Yeah,
He's untouchable.
But no. I would prefer that he. You know what? Here's the thing, Haugh. If he did trade Luis Robert Jr., which I know would not be met with a parade, it would tell us something. It would say,
yeah. You know what it'd tell us? He's the wrong guy for the job. He's overmatched.
Okay. Fair.
I'm just answering your question.
What did you think about Getz confirming that Pedro Grifol will be back in 2044? What is the rationale there?
I don't know why he had to do this. I think Chris Getz was doing fine. He is up against it. He acknowledged being an internal hire. He threw the rest of the AL Central under the bus by saying they're in the right division to win now.
Yeah.
We don't respect you, Cleveland. We don't respect you either, Detroit. Hey, Minnesota, we're coming at you. Okay. But why do you have to then add, we like this Pedro Grifol guy because I think Chris Getz had something to do with him getting hired in the first place. And we're going to bring back a manager who could preside and be in charge of a team that loses 100 games. How does that represent change? How does that inspire hope? It just doesn't. And you know what? It's another thing about the Kansas City Royals. Chris Getz, former Royal. Dayton Moore may be here this weekend. Who knows? To help Chris Getz do his job. Another Royal. Salvador Perez could be ending up being the opening day catcher with all these young pitchers.
That's not the organization to emulate
Another
anymore.
Royal. The White Sox are more obsessed with the Royals than the British people. This is ridiculous. So I just don't know why you have to commit to a manager who hasn't earned the benefit of the doubt either. Pedro Grifol hasn't covered himself in glory this year. Don't do it yet. Don't do it now. It's premature.
But don't do it.
Why did you have to do it in that moment? Pedro can take on the questions. Hey, we're focusing on this year. It's all about this year. After the season, I hope to sit down with Chris Getz and talk about the future of the Chicago White Sox. Right now, I'm just worried about what's going on in the last 30-some-odd games that we have to play. That's how Grifol could have answered those questions. When you hear the owner who said, yes, we spent a lot of money in the offseason. I don't have a Jerry Reinsdorf impression, so
That's
I'll
all
leave that
right,
to Brody.
Dustin. Carry on.
But
You're a
then
very good producer.
He's not going after
I love your work.
Ohtani. And now you keep Grifol because you got rid of Kenny and Rick. It just looks cheap. It looks cheap, right? And
It does.
And Chris Getz is doing two people's jobs.
That's cheap too.
For the price of one
That's
person's
cheap.
job, right? Because Jerry knows that this guy is getting the opportunity of a lifetime. So it's not like you can just say, well, I at least want 1.5. I at least want 1.5. I know I'm not going to get 2 full paychecks, but I want 1.5 paychecks.
Jerry Reinsdorf said yesterday, again, to repeat, this year was the worst season. It was a nightmare. It was embarrassing. It was disgusting. And yet the manager who presided over the nightmare, embarrassing, disgusting, worst season that his boss has ever seen is saying, we're going to start by bringing Pedro Grifol back. But as far as the roster is concerned, there are no untouchables there, but we got to have Pedro Grifol. What did Pedro Grifol do? Look, obviously the Sox are 28 games under 500, so you could just use that on the resume for Grifol if you would like. But there were opportunities for Grifol to shine this year during controversial times, and he simply did not. What is it about Pedro Grifol other than maybe they're rebuilding and they don't really need a real manager to preside over that?
That's not what they're doing, though, Mark.
You're right.
They're saying they're not rebuilding. They're going to try to be contending in 2024 with a manager who, as you point out, didn't really establish himself for being known for anything this year. The White Sox aren't playing smarter. They're not playing better.
Correct.
They're not sound fundamentally.
Right. He talked a good game about that stuff at the beginning of the season in terms of that, but we saw zero of that. He had no control over the locker room and had no control over critical situations.